On the Property Podcast, we like to get you ahead of the curve. We want to point out to you cities and towns that are literally going places. But this week we're going to talk about a trend that, if you understand, will put you at a real advantage as a property investor.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. This is episode 315. I am Rob D with Rob B. Thank you so much for joining us for what is going to be a really important episode. This week, we're going to give you lots to think about. Hopefully, it's one of those episodes that's going to stick with you and leave you thinking throughout the week. So lots to look forward to, and stick around to the end because we've got a resource for you that's going to help you to get more out of one of our favourite activities.
So this week's news story, the headline is Generation Rent is reshaping the UK property market. And this is from the Business Leader website. And there's some really interesting data here and information that's been taken from research put together by a software company. The research shows that city and town centres is where Generation Rent wants to live. And Generation Rent is Gen Z and millennial renters who've been priced out of home purchasing. Now, that might not come as a surprise that their preference is city or town centre living. What kind of surprised me, Rob, was how many. It says that 91% of that group wants to live in city or town centres, which is huge. I thought it would be the majority, but that's quite overwhelming. That's a big number.
It is a big number, and the article also talks about how this is good news for the high street because it opens up opportunities for redeveloping former retail premises that would otherwise be sitting empty, because I think the shift away from retail and to buying online isn't going to flip back anytime soon. So you've got lots of empty buildings that can be repurposed either for residential or for uses that are going to appeal to the kind of people who are going to be living in that area now. So it doesn't talk about this in the article, but for example, on Oxford Street, there's a former department store that's now a really good mini golf course. So this shift does open up interesting opportunities. And it also talks in the article about how having this larger number of renters is likely to drive up standards, which I think is a really good point. The fact that people aren't owning their own homes as much is presented in the media always as a problem. And yes, of course, there are problems attached to it, but there is an upside as well. The fact that there are more renters and there are more affluent renters who are willing to spend money for good experiences means that there's going to be more choice in the sector, and there's lots of big companies coming into that sector wanting to provide that experience. And you'll be able to find the link in the show notes for this episode. Now, the news story we've just been talked about ties very nicely into today's main topic, which is the return to city centre living. This trend is something that we've picked up on. We started talking about it a little bit towards the end of last year, and we thought it was sufficiently important that we should explore it in full in the Property Hub magazine. And in fact, it's on the cover of the magazine that's going to be landing on your doormats anytime soon if you're a subscriber.
And if you're not a subscriber, head along to propertyhub.net/magazine and make yourself one. Don't miss out. Okay, city centres. What's happened? Before we get to the why this is happening, let's quickly look at the past and the present. Let's see what's played out in city centres over the years. Well, not so long ago, even a couple of decades ago, city centres were places people did not want to live. They didn't have the facilities. They were empty in the week, busy at the weekends for people going in drinking. But that was about it, really. Even London in the 80s fell into that same category. So it was pretty much blanket for all cities in the UK. Living in them just wasn't seen as a good thing to do. And actually, people who had succeeded were people who had managed to get out to the suburbs. But things have started to change, and now city centre living has never been so popular. The population of Birmingham has grown by 163% since the turn of the millennium. And Liverpool, since the turn of the millennium, has grown by 181%. Big growth, and that trend line is continuing. But as big as these numbers are, they are not a shock to us because so much has changed.
Yeah, what we're really seeing here, I think, is the convergence of two different factors. One is big regeneration schemes, bringing city centres back to use. Some of that is driven by local authorities, and that makes sense because if they can bring people back to the city centre and they can regenerate those areas, then that means they can charge more in the way of business rates and council tax and ultimately bring more revenue in. It's also coming from private developers. Urban Splash, whose co-founder we had on the podcast late last year, being a shining example of that. They saw what was about to happen very early. They got in there and they bravely transformed areas where really there wasn't much going for them into places where people wanted to live. And what kind of people? Well, it's those pesky avocado-loving millennials. Apparently, we just about qualify as millennials, Rob, so people like us.
Yes, indeedy. People in their 20s comprise half the population of some UK city centres, which is staggering. But again, should we be so shocked? Because there's so much going for them. There's more and more office-based roles. Many big businesses are relocating into city centres. So previously they may have been in parks outside a city centre or near a motorway, and they still exist. But many businesses that don't need to be on those networks are moving into city centres. So therefore, more employment opportunities are presenting themselves. But it's not just jobs. It's the convenience of it all as well. The ability to walk to work, to walk to a gym. And when I mean walk, within a few minutes, or depending on the type of accommodation, they may have a gym, a concierge, and possibly even a swimming pool in some of the apartment buildings that people are living in. So it's all about convenience, and that transcends to technology as well. The ability to order on your phone and get something delivered within 2 hours from Amazon, have somebody go to a restaurant and pick you up a meal from Deliveroo, or have a taxi arrive in minutes that's reliable from a service like Uber. All of those things sound futuristic, but that's city centre living today. It's crazy, actually. 10 years ago, it didn't exist, but it's here now. And people want to take advantage of that. People feel like they're missing out if they don't have access to those services. So more and more people are moving into city centres. And if anything, the population growth that we've seen already will only increase because city centre living is convenient living.
And that's it. I think what this was reflecting is a change of priorities from a significant segment of the population. It used to be the case that people would prioritise space. People wanted the biggest home that they could have, and that would often mean moving out to the suburbs, and they were happy to do that because they wanted space. Now, people are valuing convenience more than that. They'd rather live somewhere smaller, but that's on the doorstep of everything they want, rather than live in a mansion somewhere that's a bit more isolated. And some of this comes back to the changing the ways people live as well. It used to be the case that people would get married in their very early 20s and have kids, but now increasingly people are delaying that until their 30s if they do it at all, which means there's this whole period of their lives when people's priorities are more social and are around activities and are around work. But even though that's where the demand is coming from now, I don't know if it's necessarily the case that everybody who's living in the city now is eventually going to grow up and move out. At the moment, city centre accommodation is largely 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom flats, but already we're starting to see some build-to-rent developers building 3 and even 4-bedroom units and deliberately targeting developments at a range of people, including those with families. So time will tell, but I don't think we're necessarily talking just about a young person phenomenon here. I think we're talking about a general shift in what matters to people because there are so many opportunities now, which, as you said, Rob, weren't around 10 years ago.
I agree, Rob. And it's going to be very hard for people who've lived this way to suddenly stop. So we could see this trend aging upwards. And because of this, because of its increasing demand, and because of this trend possibly aging up in the future, this really impacts supply and demand. So understandably, sometimes people get nervous about oversupply in city centres. And we've seen this in recent years. If we go back to the last property cycle, Leeds was highlighted as a city that had an oversupply of apartments. And it could be argued that was true. And there were properties lying empty because not enough people were living in the city centre at that time. What actually went on to happen was everyone stopped building in Leeds, and because that went on for so long, there's now an undersupply. That's a whole different story. But we do believe things are different now. And that's because the cities are different. In the last cycle, we didn't have any of the technology we've previously mentioned. So a big draw to being in the cities wasn't present yet. Also, a lot of the facilities and regen projects in these cities hadn't been built out. And the type of accommodation as well is changing. And the type of accommodation now really draws people in. There's lots of things that have changed from the last cycle to this cycle, which makes city centre living so much more appealing. And you only have to look to Manchester in this cycle to see how that is changing. So despite plans for 10,000 new apartments, which may sound a lot, rents are on the rise because demand is outstripping supply. That's right. Even though there are cranes up in the air in Manchester, and people often say, cranes in the air, beware. Actually, Manchester needs those cranes right now because so many people are pouring into the city. It is very much and very quickly becoming the London of the North, and they need the high-end accommodation to be able to service that demand. But the trouble is, those apartments are planned. But I know in Manchester now, there isn't a lot of land left in the city centre. So that supply and demand challenge only increases. And if you look at London as a case point, London is what Manchester may become. It's a city that there isn't much space to build in, and therefore that supply and demand ratio is exaggerated further. And Rob, we weren't the first to jump on this. Someone who really changed our views on city centres and got us thinking about this in a bigger way was Tom Bloxham.
Yeah, very much so. It's amazing how a half-hour conversation can really flip your thinking on something. It's not like we weren't bullish on cities before. We were, but what we hadn't fully appreciated was a point that he made, which is that everywhere else in Europe, pretty much, it's more expensive to live in the centre of a city than it is on the outskirts or in the suburbs. And in London, that's also the case. But in most of the other cities of the UK, that's not the case. It's actually cheaper to live in the city centre than it is in the suburbs. And that never felt weird to us. It's probably never felt weird to you because that's how things have always been. That's what we're used to. But when you think about it, it is weird. You expect the best locations to command the highest prices. And when you're talking about best location, you could sometimes be talking about something that's got rarity value like waterfront property. You could sometimes be talking about something that's in an area of outstanding beauty. But often you're talking about amenities and facilities, and that's where city centres excel. So it is really strange that at the moment, most UK city centres are cheaper than the surrounding areas. And Tom's view is that that is going to flip at some point. City centres are going to become more expensive, driven by a lot of the things we've been talking about today. And when he said that, Rob, it was like, oh yeah, of course that's what's going to happen. But we'd never thought about it before.
It did, but the secret isn't now between you, ourselves and Tom. Others are onto this already. That's why we have build to rent now. Build to rent, for those who aren't aware, are people who are developing apartment blocks in the city centre but are renting them all out. They don't go to market. You can't buy them as a buy-to-let. You can't buy them as an owner-occupier. They are normally for pension companies because they can see this trend and they want to take advantage of it in a big way. Now, pension money is normally smart money. So this is a trend that you should pay attention to. And again, Leeds is a great example of this. So we said that previously in the last property cycle, Leeds had an oversupply. There are cranes in the air in Leeds again, and there are apartments being built in the city centre. But you try and buy one. The vast majority of those apartments going up are all built to rent for pension companies. There is very, very little coming to the market. They know that this trend is happening and they are very much taking advantage of it. But they're not just building apartment blocks. They're building apartment blocks with facilities such as concierge, gyms, swimming pools. And some are even being more forward thinking and building tech into these apartments as well. So you can have your Uber account linked to your property. You can order from your room. Your concierge service doesn't just pick up your parcels. It's like having your own hotel service. You can get things like dry cleaning done. It really is a very different place. The rental market in city centres is becoming a very different place to what it was before. Now, what does that mean for property investors? Yes, this city centre trend means that property prices could do very, very well in the future, but you can't just go and buy anything. And Rob and I talk about this all the time. You can't go and buy in any area, and you can't just go and buy any product. Two mistakes to avoid in city centres is buying on the outskirts of a city centre in a not so desirable area. If that area doesn't improve and the ripple effect doesn't take hold, then you may struggle, particularly if it's priced like a city centre already. And apartment blocks that don't compete on specification or facilities, you've got to be doing better now as a landlord. The good news is now that PRS is a long way off from dominating the market, but we're giving you a very advanced forward notice that we're going to have to up our levels as individual investors to compete with the pension companies. And Rob, this is not new. We've seen this take place in a smaller market, which is the student rental market.
Very much so. It used to be the case that students would live in big, drafty, terraced houses. It would be damp, it would be dirty, it would be nasty. And that was kind of part of the fun. But now, while that kind of accommodation is still available, it's struggling. It's struggling because there's all this purpose-built accommodation that's got all these amazing facilities, that's more central, that's more convenient. It's not like the entire student house share market has been wiped out. But as each year goes by, it gets progressively harder to rent out the poorer quality accommodation. You see some areas where rents have fallen quite dramatically, and everyone who wants to stay in that market is having to raise their standards in terms of furnishings and adding on suites and all that kind of thing. These trends take time to play out. So the student market has been adapting for a decade or more probably, and the transformation still hasn't fully taken place. You're seeing it in some cities more than others, but it's still in progress. And the same goes for everything that we're talking about today. We're talking about a long-term trend here. So it's not like next year you have to go and get iPads wired into all your properties. This is just something to be aware of now because it's something that is changing gradually. It also doesn't mean that if you've got a property in a more suburban location or in a town, that it's going to be empty in a few years' time. Of course not. There's still going to be demand for every type of property, and there's still not enough being built in the UK as a whole. So this isn't something to worry about, it's something to be aware of. It's a trend that you can take advantage of if you want to. And while property investment will work in all kinds of different places in all kinds of different ways, it's all these things that we've been talking about today that explain why we are so bullish on city centres for the long term.
That's right, Rob. And that's why in the news story today, it talks about town centres and city centres. It's not just exclusive to city centres. I think the reason why we're really highlighting this and wanted to put a podcast together on this subject and a more detailed magazine article is because that actually people don't think this way. And this isn't a common view. So we wanted to make an uncommon view a little bit more mainstream. And it'll give you now something to think about as you plan your investment journey. Remember, none of this is going to impact on the very short term. This is an absolute longer term trend. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is happening. So you understanding it is really powerful. Getting in early on a trend and seeing the future before others do puts you at a real advantage. Now, this podcast we've covered a fair bit already, but the article in the magazine goes on to cover this in so much more depth. So dig into this article. And as we said, if you haven't subscribed already, go to propertyhub.net/magazine. And if you're listening to this in the future and thinking, oh, I've missed out, don't worry. You can access all the back issues digitally. So if you're subscribed now, you've got the whole back catalogue you can take advantage of. So, Rob, last week, we bared our souls and we talked about a pretty big event, which was our first development and our pretty big mess up. Now, it was nervous recording that because we didn't know how it was going to be received. But that was stupid because we forgot how awesome Property Podcast listeners are and the Property Hub community is because the feedback was amazing.
Yeah, we've had some fantastic feedback. So Petra has said, I listen to podcasts daily on different topics. This one is by far the best, most honest and helpful I've ever listened to. And Ali said, what an awesome episode. Massive respect and well done to you for posting about the truth of business, which is failure, setbacks and tough lessons. So many people are just posting about wins, bling and success to feed their own ego. So Rob, things like that are great to hear because we thought the feedback might be, why the hell should we keep on listening to you guys? Clearly you don't have a clue what you're talking about. But there was lots of other great feedback as well.
Yeah, so many people made a similar comment, which is nice to see the pros make mistakes. And I think that's what really helped people. The last week's episode was that we're all making mistakes. And as you, as an investor, are making them, you could listen to things like the Property Podcast and go, well, those guys are smashing it, aren't they? You know, why aren't I doing that? Why am I the only one making mistakes? And that's why we wanted to really talk about it last week, is to let you know that we do. A lot. We make so many mistakes. You know, we joked about making a business podcast because actually we could give you endless amounts of material on the mistakes we make. Mistakes are part and parcel of life. It's great that so many of you supported the content we put out last week. And I just want to say one final thank you. I've said it on social media a few times, but one final thank you. You know, it really does motivate us to give you more, to create more and share more. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for being awesome. We'll continue to bring you stuff like we've done. Hopefully not as big as losses as last week, but if it happens, we'll tell you about it.
So we're nearly at the end of this week's podcast, but we've just got time to squeeze in Hub Extra. This is the part of the show where we give you that little bit more, whether it's a quote, a tool or a resource of some kind, and it's all backed up by the Hub Extra email, which Property Hub subscribers get in their inbox every Friday morning.
Yes, and this week, we're helping you escape the city. So we've just told you all about why the city centre living is a big future trend that you need to pay attention to. But this week, we're helping you to get away. Because for all the attraction of city centre living, nature is pretty important too. So this week's app is awesome. It's free to download. It's called Go Jointly. That's GoJaun And it is an app to help you find walks in your area. There is a premium service, but you don't need to use it. There's loads and loads of free content on there. It's got all different categories. So you've got things like currently short spring strolls. You've got the latest added walk section, waterside strolls. You've got raise the pulse, so more difficult strolls. You've got family strolls. And of course, you've got walks that are near you. What I really like about it is it doesn't just show you a map and tells you to head off. It gives you pictures of the walk itself so you can make sure you're on the right direction. And those pictures are provided by people who've been out on those walks already. So it's really great. It's built by the app's community. It's a fantastic app. It's sometimes a little bit difficult navigating from your phone on a map, particularly if you're wandering through the countryside. I've done it. It's not easy. Even more difficult if you lose signal. So this app is great. Free to download. For me, if you like a walk, which I certainly do, this is a bit of a no-brainer.
So that's us done for this week. Hope you've enjoyed it. Let us know what else you want to hear. We've been talking about how much we love your feedback. So let us know what you want us to talk about in the future. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Property Hub UK. And if you're newer to the Property Hub and you want to know a little bit about everything we've got going on, all the different things that we can offer you in terms of services and free education, then join us on our Discovery Tour, where you can join us live and we'll walk you through everything that's on offer. You can sign up for that for free at propertyhub.net/discover. We'll be back with another great episode next week and, of course, with Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday. So until then, have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.